So picture this. It's 1955, and the British Foreign Secretary stands up in the House of Commons, and he publicly clears a man named Kim Philby of being a Soviet spy.
Right, which was just a massive public exoneration.
Yeah, exactly. And following that, Philby holds this incredibly confident, just utterly charming press conference. And he does it right in his mother's living room, of all places.
I mean, the optics of that are just wild.
They really are. He looks the cameras dead in the eye, and he states unequivocally that he had never been a communist. But, he was lying through his teeth.
Oh, completely.
He had actually been a Soviet agent for over 2 decades by that point. And the absolute craziest part of this whole story, his bosses practically helped him get away with it.
The audacity of that press conference is just, well, it's staggering when you dig into the evidence that was actively being ignored or, suppressed by his own colleagues.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We have an incredible stack of sources today detailing the life of Harold Adrian Russell Philby.
Better known to history as Kim Philby.
Right, the guy widely considered the most devastatingly successful member of the infamous Cambridge 5 spy ring. Our mission today is to figure out how this one man pulled off the ultimate deception right under the noses of the world's premier intelligence agencies.
Because looking through these files, what stands out isn't just the stolen secrets. I mean, the secrets are huge, but it's really the psychology of the deception.
Yeah, because Philby didn't just use, invisible ink and dead drops. He weaponized the British establishment's own arrogance. He used their obsession with social class as this impenetrable shield.
Exactly. It serves as this terrifying masterclass in how institutional blindness allows the most dangerous threats to hide in plain sight.
We like to think intelligence agencies operate on, cold, hard facts.
Rigorous vetting, polygraphs, that sort of thing. But these sources reveal a system where a good pedigree and the right school tie could just completely override basic counterintelligence.
So let's trace this back to the beginning. How does a child of the British Empire become its greatest enemy?
Well, he was born in 1912 in British India, and in this bizarre twist of fate, he was nicknamed Kim after Rudyard Kipling's famous fictional boy spy.
You literally can't make that up.
You really can't, and he was practically born into the establishment. His father, St. John Philby, was this larger-than-life eccentric explorer, a civil servant, and even an advisor to the King of Saudi Arabia.
So Kim grew up thoroughly embedded in the elite echelons of British society. He went to the prestigious Westminster School, then to Trinity College, Cambridge. He was quite literally being groomed to rule the empire.
Right, but Cambridge is where the track shifts entirely. He graduates in 1933, and the sources note he already had a really strong leaning towards communism.
This wasn't just, a phase of reading Karl Marx in a dorm room and arguing philosophy.
No, not at all. By 1934, he is on the ground in Vienna, actively aiding refugees who are fleeing the rise of fascism. And that physical high-stakes environment is where he meets a young Austrian communist named Litzi Friedman.
Litzi is such a compelling figure in this timeline. She was deeply, practically committed to the cause. There's this fantastic detail in the sources about their first meeting.
Oh, the money story.
Yes. She immediately asks him how much money he has to his name. He says 100 pounds. And she literally calculates his living expenses on the spot, figures out he has 25 pounds left over, and just demands he give the excess to the International Organization for Aid for Revolutionaries.
Which is just incredible, and he was completely captivated by that intense determination.
Yeah, they get married shortly after, which, conveniently gives her a British passport to escape to the UK with him.
And that return to London in 1934 is where the actual intelligence operation begins. He meets a man in Regent's Park who introduces himself simply as Otto.
But we know him now as the brilliant Soviet agent Arnold Deutsch.
Exactly. Deutsch formally recruits Philby into Soviet intelligence. And Philby doesn't just sign up. He immediately starts scouting his own social circle, recommending his Cambridge peers to the Soviets.
People like Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess. Okay, let's unpack this for a second because it's an incredible betrayal.
Oh, massive.
It's like he was given the golden ticket to the chocolate factory, but instead of eating the candy, he secretly started drawing up blueprints to burn the place down for a rival company.
That's a great way to put it. And what this reveals about Soviet strategy at the time is really remarkable. I mean, Arnold Deutsch wasn't just wandering around London looking for malcontents.
Right. The Soviets specifically targeted elite institutions, like University College, London, and Cambridge.
Because they recognized that dropping Russian agents with fake accents into the British government was, incredibly risky. and inefficient. They needed assets who naturally belonged there.
Young, ideological men who would effortlessly rise to the top of British society without raising a single eyebrow.
Exactly. But holding radical communist beliefs at university is one thing. Actually getting a job in British intelligence is another entirely.
Yeah, you can't just stroll into MI6 with a well-known history of socialist meetings and an Austrian communist wife.
Right. So he essentially had to murder his own identity and build a flawless right-wing cover. So he and Litzy actually separate. It was amicable, but strictly necessary for the mission.
And then he takes a job editing a struggling trade magazine, right? Deliberately shifting its editorial focus to promote Anglo-German trade.
Yeah, he uses this position to cozy up to prominent fascists, including the German ambassador, Joachim von Ribbentrop. He even joins the Anglo-German Fellowship,
Which was an organization specifically meant to build friendly ties with Nazi Germany. So he just goes all in on this hardcore conservative persona.
He really does. And it culminates in 1937 when he goes to the Spanish Civil War. He's working as a freelance journalist, eventually landing a prestigious gig reporting for the Times.
But he doesn't embed with the anti-fascist Republicans he secretly supports. He embeds himself at the headquarters of General Franco's fascist forces.
Which leads to the Tyrol incident, which honestly might be the most absurd piece of luck in espionage history.
Oh, this is wild. So it's December 1937. Philby is traveling in a car with 3 other journalists, and a Republican shell-fired by the very anti-fascist forces he is secretly working for hits right in front of their vehicle.
The 3 other journalists are killed instantly. But Philby, he survives with just a minor head wound.
Wait, so getting blown up actually helped his career as a Soviet spy?
Oh, immensely.
It's like the ultimate twisted plot armor. Suddenly, an artillery strike by his own side nearly kills him, but instead, General Franco personally awards Philby the Red Cross of military merit.
The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. Philby later noted that up until that artillery shell hit, Franco's officers were highly suspicious of British journalists. They assumed they were all secret leftists.
But getting blown up and receiving a medal from the fascist dictator himself? I mean, that opened every single conservative door in Europe to him. Nobody suspects a thing.
And there's a deeper layer of absurdity here regarding his Soviet handler at the time, Theodore Malley.
Oh, right. I remember reading about Marley in the notes. He had given Philby a completely different assignment in Spain, hadn't he?
He had. Marley had actually tasked Philby with analyzing Franco's security detail to find vulnerabilities for a potential assassination attempt.
Wow.
But Marley eventually reported back to the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, that Philby lacked the, quote, physical courage, unquote, to pull off a hit.
That's hilarious. So Philby completely fails at his actual Soviet mission to kill Franco, but accidentally earns a fascist medal that cements his reputation as a staunch, reliable conservative back in London.
It is the perfect disguise, arriving at exactly the perfect time, because when World War II breaks out, British intelligence is desperate to expand its ranks.
And in 1940, writing on the recommendation of his chaotic Cambridge friend Guy Burgess, Philby officially joins MI6.
He bounces around a bit, from Section D to the Special Operations Executive, but by 1941 he lands in Section 5, where he is running counterintelligence for Spain and Portugal.
And by all accounts, he was really highly competent at his day job. His intelligence work actively helped stop the German Abwehr from setting up detection stations around Gibraltar.
But, climbing the ranks meant gaining access to an immense trove of secrets. It forced him into this terrifying dual existence.
Right, he had to excel for the British to maintain his cover while actively neutralizing any intelligence that threatened the Soviet Union or his own identity.
Which brings us to the moment he pulls off the ultimate inside job. He maneuvers politically to oust his own boss, Felix Cowgill.
And when Cowgill is pushed out, Philby takes his place as the head of Section 9. Now, for you listening, Section 9 isn't just any department. It is MI6's newly formed anti-communist division.
It's like hiring the bank robber to design the bank's vault.
Exactly. Here's where it gets really interesting. The head of the anti-communist division is a communist spy, and he literally has to investigate his own leaks. It's a total hall of mirrors. How did nobody in London notice this?
This gets to the very core of the institutional blindness we discussed earlier. Philby actually gave a secret lecture years later to Stasi agents in East Germany where he explained his survival.
What did he tell them?
He told them it was almost entirely due to the British class system. The intelligence community in London at the time wasn't built on rigorous background checks. It was an old boys' club. Recruitment often happened over drinks at private gentlemen's clubs in St. James's.
So it was entirely about pedigree. Because he went to Westminster and Trinity College, he possessed this invisible shield.
Precisely. It was simply inconceivable to the upper crust of MI6 that a man of his breeding, who wore the right suits and belonged to the right clubs, could possibly be a traitor. He was, one of us.
Even when massive, glaring red flags appeared, they just rationalized them away. A perfect example is the Volkov affair in 1945.
Oh, this incident is almost comical in its blatant corruption.
So Konstantin Volkov was an NKVD agent stationed in Istanbul who decided he wanted to defect to Britain. In exchange for money and political asylum, Volkov offers to hand over the names of 3 high-level Soviet agents operating inside British intelligence.
And the physical description he provides for one of those agents matches Kim Philby down to the letter.
Right. And because of the bureaucratic structure, the offer from this defector lands directly on the desk of the head of the anti-communist division.
Which means the man in charge of handling the defector threatening to expose Kim Philby is Kim Philby.
You literally couldn't write a more stressful scenario for a spy, but he handles it with this chilling bureaucratic calmness.
He intentionally insists that all communication regarding Volkov must happen via the physical diplomatic bag rather than telegraph, citing, security concerns.
So he stretches a process that should have taken hours into 3 weeks. And during that manufactured delay, he tips off his handlers in Moscow.
Yeah. By the time Philby finally travels to Turkey to, quote-unquote, meet the defector, Volkov has completely vanished. He had been heavily bandaged, bundled onto a Soviet plane, and was never seen again.
And his British bosses merely chalked it up to bad luck, assuming the Soviets had simply been vigilant.
But the sheer audacity of Philby's actions actually created a fascinating problem on the other side of the Iron Curtain.
Right, because an analyst in Moscow named Elena Marginskaya was reviewing the material coming from the Cambridge Five.
She looked at Philby's reports, which consistently claimed that British intelligence had zero penetration into Soviet networks.
I imagine the KGB was totally paranoid. I mean, a guy who lies this well to his own countrymen for decades isn't exactly someone you trust implicitly.
Exactly. She couldn't fathom that MI6 was genuinely that incompetent. She analyzed the ease with which Philby operated and concluded that he must actually be a British double agent feeding Moscow high-level disinformation. To her mind, no intelligence agency could be that thoroughly blinded by class allegiance. She assumed it was a trap because his success seemed entirely too easy.
But the shield of the British class system could only protect him for so long. Eventually, he has to deal with the Americans who, don't really care where he went to boarding school.
Right. We're moving into the late 40s and early 50s, where the House of Cards finally starts to collapse. In 1949, Philby is sent to Washington, D.C. as the chief British intelligence liaison to the newly formed CIA.
There, he works closely with James Jesus Angleton, a brilliant, highly paranoid American counterintelligence officer who already had lingering suspicions about Philby.
But Angleton isn't even the biggest problem. It's the technology. The Americans had launched the Venona project. They were intercepting and mathematically decrypting top-secret Soviet diplomatic traffic.
And through these decrypts, they prove that there's a high-level spy operating inside the British embassy in Washington, operating under the codename Homer.
Because of his senior liaison role, Philby is fully briefed on this highly classified hunt. As soon as he sees the profile of Homer, he instantly knows it is his old Cambridge friend and fellow spy, Donald Maclean.
So Philby is forced to sit in meetings with the Americans, pretending to actively hunt for this spy, while secretly trying to figure out how to protect Maclean without exposing himself.
And right at this pressure cooker moment, Guy Burgess crashes into his life again.
Guy Burgess is the wild card that ruins everything. He was another member of the Cambridge Five, but unlike Philby, he was spectacularly undisciplined. He drank heavily, he was emotionally erratic, and in October 1950, he gets assigned to the British Embassy in Washington and moves directly into Philby's family home.
It was an absolute disaster for Philby's cover. Burgess was offending everyone in Washington's social circles.
Didn't J. Edgar Hoover get involved?
He did. The head of the FBI was personally complaining about him because Burgess was using his diplomatic immunity to avoid getting arrested while racking up speeding tickets and just engaging in reckless behavior across the city.
There is that one detail from the sources where a guest comes over in the morning and finds Philby and Burgess in the bedroom drinking champagne. They had apparently gone to the embassy, realized they were entirely too hungover and drunk to function, and just went back home to keep drinking.
It's a miracle they weren't caught right then. But Philby, being the master manipulator, realizes he can actually weaponize Burgess's chaotic nature.
Right. Maclean was back in England by this point and was rapidly becoming the prime suspect for the Venona League. Philby desperately needed to send a warning to Maclean to flee before the net closed.
So Burgess intentionally goes out in Virginia and gets 3 egregious speeding tickets in a single day. He aggressively claims diplomatic immunity, creates a massive scene, and gets himself deported back to London in absolute disgrace.
It's brilliant in a very dark way. He uses an embarrassing diplomatic incident as a free ticket back to the UK.
And it works. On May 25, 1951, Burgess drives Maclean to Southampton. They hop on a steamship to France and eventually make their way behind the Iron Curtain to Moscow.
But Burgess defecting with Maclean wasn't part of Philby's plan, was it?
Not at all. Burgess was strictly supposed to facilitate Maclean's escape and stay behind. The fact that Burgess panicked and defected alongside him was catastrophic for Philby.
Because Philby and Burgess were intimately linked? They had literally just been sharing a house in Washington. Suddenly, the spotlight swings directly onto Philby.
Yeah, MI5 and the CIA start wondering if Philby is the third man who tipped them off.
The pressure becomes insurmountable. Philby resigns from MI6 in July 1951 to avoid being officially fired. He returns to London and faces relentless interrogation by MI5.
But he never breaks. He just calmly, repeatedly denies everything.
Which leads to that 1955 moment we talked about at the top of the show, where Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan essentially says, "We have no evidence this gentleman has done anything wrong." The establishment just circles the wagons.
And following that exoneration, MI6 inexplicably re-employs him.
Wait, really?
Yes. By 1956, he's stationed in Beirut, Lebanon. Officially, he's working as a foreign correspondent for The Observer and The Economist. But secretly, he is right back to doing freelance intelligence work for MI6.
He marries his third wife, Eleanor, and for a few years, it seems like he has completely beaten the system.
Yeah.
Until 1961.
Right, Anatoly Golitsyn.
A major in the KGB who defects to the United States. And he brings a treasure trove of intelligence that definitively confirms Kim Philby was the third man.
The evidence is finally too overwhelming to ignore, even for the British upper class. So MI6 dispatches Nicholas Elliot to Beirut in 1962.
And Elliot was a close friend of Philby's, right? A man who had staunchly defended his innocence for a decade.
He was sent to secure a full confession. And the Philby that Elliot finds in Beirut is just a shell of a man. The decades of paranoia had taken their toll.
He was drinking himself to death, deeply depressed. At one point, he had fallen against a radiator in a drunken stupor and literally cracked his skull.
Elliot confronts him in a safe house and says, "I once looked up to you, Kim. My God, how I despise you now." And Philby finally breaks. He admits to it all. But he asks for a brief delay before signing the formal written confession.
And on January 23, 1963, Philby vanishes into the night. He fails to show up for a dinner party with the first secretary of the British embassy.
That very same morning, a Soviet freighter called the Dolmatova slipped out of Beirut harbor so quickly that they left their cargo scattered across the docks. Philby was on board, bound for Odessa.
Now, this raises one of the most heavily debated questions among historians. If MI6 had him dead to rights in Beirut and they knew he was a flight risk, why didn't they arrest him immediately?
That's a great question.
Did they intentionally leave the back door wide open so he would flee to Moscow, specifically to avoid the public humiliation of putting an establishment darling on trial?
Prominent historians, including Ben McIntyre, strongly suspect that was the case. Even Philby himself later speculated that MI6 let him run.
That's fascinating.
What this reveals about the nature of power is really profound. Institutional embarrassment often dictates national security policy. A highly publicized trial wouldn't just expose a single spy, it would humiliate the entire British intelligence apparatus, dismantle the myth of their competence, and, indict the ruling class that had protected him for 30 years.
So they let him run. He finally escapes to the Soviet Union, the workers' paradise he's been serving in secret since he was a young man in Vienna. But the reality waiting for him in Moscow was completely different from the ideological fantasy he had built in his head.
Oh, the arrival in Moscow was a brutal wake-up call. Philby expected a hero's welcome. He believed he would instantly be minted as a high-ranking KGB colonel with all the associated privileges.
And what actually happened?
He was essentially placed under virtual house arrest. The Soviets gave him a meager stipend of 500 rubles a month and kept him under constant surveillance by armed guards.
Because they still didn't trust him. The same paranoia that Elena Modzinskaya had in the 40s was still alive. They were terrified. This master deceiver might change his mind, re-defect back to London, and become a massive propaganda disaster for the Soviets.
Oh, It took 10 full years before the KGB trusted him enough to let him give training seminars to new recruits. And the reality of Soviet civilian life deeply shocked him.
His wife later recounted that he was brought to tears seeing the extreme poverty of the elderly citizens in Moscow, crying out that these were the people who had won the war and this was how they were forced to live.
Not to mention the mundane cultural isolation. He spent his life trying to destroy the British Empire, but once he was cut off from it, he publicly claimed no regrets while privately begging visitors to bring him English comforts.
He desperately missed his London clubs, Coleman's mustard, and Lee and Perrin's Worcestershire sauce.
Yeah, and his eventual job with the KGB was equally depressing. In the 1970s, they finally put him to work in the Active Measures Department.
Doing what?
While his primary duty was forging CIA and U.S. State Department documents to spread disinformation in the developing world. The KGB would write the propaganda, and Philby's sole value was reviewing the text to ensure the English idioms, the diplomatic tone, and the grammar were perfectly authentic.
So what does this all mean? It's tragically ironic. He spends his entire life trying to destroy the British establishment, only to end up missing its condiments and acting as a glorified grammar checker for Soviet disinformation.
He was a man utterly trapped by his own success. To cope with the overwhelming disappointment of Soviet reality, he had to aggressively rationalize his choices.
He maintained until his death that the core communist ideals were right, but the human execution in Russia was simply flawed.
He argued the fault lay with the bureaucrats, not the system. He could never bring himself to fully admit that his life's work was dedicated to a fundamentally broken enterprise. He died in 1988 of heart failure.
He was given a state funeral with the honors of a KGB general, but his final decades were largely defined by isolation, heavy drinking, and profound depression. Which brings us to the end of our deep dives into the Cambridge Five's most elusive shadow. There is so much to synthesize from this timeline.
If there is a central takeaway from these sources, it is that Philby's unprecedented success wasn't merely a product of his intellect or his tradecraft. His true genius was his ability to exploit the social blind spots of the people around him.
Yeah.
It challenges us to look at our own modern systems and ask, when we place our trust in leaders or institutions today, are we still just falling for the comforting illusion of a good pedigree?
It's an unsettling question.
Yeah.
And it leaves you with one final lingering thought from the sources that we haven't touched on yet. Throughout this entire discussion, we've talked about the macro-level damage, the geopolitical impact, the stolen state secrets, the compromised intelligence networks. But the sources reveal a much more intimate, horrifying collateral damage to living a life of total, unyielding deception. During the height of Philby's paranoia and stress in the late 40s and 50s, his second wife, Aileen, suffered severe, catastrophic psychiatric breakdowns.
It's incredibly tragic.
The strain of living alongside his hidden life, the unspoken tension in their home was so intense that she resorted to staging horrific accidents. She began injecting herself with urine and insulin to cause severe skin disfigurations, a physical manifestation of the psychological torture of their environment, before she eventually died at a tragically young age.
Yeah.
When someone lives a life of absolute sociopathic falsehood, it doesn't just destabilize global governments, it psychologically destroys the people sleeping in the next room. It leaves you wondering, can a master deceiver ever truly love anyone? Or is every single person in their life just another asset to be managed?